Now, the next phase of this that also becomes important is everything that's happening over here in the hard drive world. Now, I've kind of just isolated these elements as external hard drives because I want to talk about how external hard drives communicate and directly affect what's happening in the system. Right now, at this time, I think the average assumed M1 processor chip on Apple's MacBook Pro internal drive transfer rate was still less than 5 gigabits per second. But the new Pro Max M1 chip is supposed to boast higher than 7 gigabits per second in transfer rate. So that gigabit per second is how much data can be transferred to and from the hard drive to the main system. But let's take a look at this real quick. First of all, we have the connection protocol. What is being connected? Is it USB? Is it FireWire? Is it Thunderbolt? And then we have the load that's being transferred, which really weighs in on how important it is to have a fluid communication between the hard drive and the computer. And then we have the hard drives themselves. So if we start at the hard drive themselves, let's just mention a couple things. In our standard hard disk drive that has a moving disk, the at 7200 RPM, which is the fastest speed that it's usually commercially available, we're only getting a transfer speed of 6 gigabits per second. If we were to connect that device, though, across to a protocol like USB 2, the transfer rate for a USB 2 is only 480 megabits per second, which means that 6 gigabit transfer is not super important because it's not even barely being used. 1/12 of it is being used in this instance. In the same way, you see that issue with FireWire 400. But all of a sudden, now going into USB 3, we almost have the full capability of being able to utilize this. You can see FireWire 800, which essentially has 800 megabits per second, but also has powered bus on board. So there's a little bit of an instance where this gets improved in terms of the audio and video capability. So surprisingly, definitely from my experience, FireWire 800 has been far more fluid than USB 3. But it also depends on what's happening at the computer side as to whether or not these speeds are even being used internally by the computer, even if the connection is there. So that's another piece to add on to it. But let's go look at now the solid state drives get us all the way up to 240 gigabits per second. That 240 gigabit per second at this time is not matched by a protocol that can communicate at that speed. So while that sounds super fast, right now our fastest protocol communication back and forth is 40 gigabits per second at Thunderbolt 3. Now Thunderbolt 3 looks exactly like USB-C, but it's not exactly the same protocol. USB-C has different variants in speed, and so it can have USB-C super speed that can go up to 20 gigabits per second. But if it's not clearly a Thunderbolt 3, it's not going to be using the 40 gigabit per second transfer. It could be as low as 5. And if you look at that, that's only 1 gigabit per second faster than USB 3, and it's not faster than Thunderbolt 2. And so that's pretty interesting if you kind of look at that. So Thunderbolt 2 and Thunderbolt 3, of course, reign supreme on the fastest transfers. So again, at this point in time, we don't have anything that's fast enough to necessarily transfer the SSD level of communication yet or speed on that disk, but we will in the future. And if we go look at that, the other question is, and something that's not necessarily notable until you actually get real deep into the computer systems, is whether or not if the computer even though it has a 40 gigabit transfer protocol attached to it, does the CPU throttle that gigabit in incoming input to something less than to actually get that kind of speed. And so you can actually download an app that'll test disk speed transfer rates from your computer to that system to get a sense of whether or not you're even operating at that speed. So Thunderbolt 3, if you were to match up a Thunderbolt 3 with an SSD, you'd be at the highest level that you could possibly be, but your computer system might not even be technically running at that level at this point in time. And that's why future updates are super important. And when they talk about speed, it seems like every time there's a new release of a computer, it's, oh, we've increased speed. And you're like, well, how? Because, these speeds have been the same for forever and they're still using the same protocol. A lot of times it's because when they first initially released these the first time, or even the first few generations, they're not really at full speed at the computer.